today is an incredible day just to pause, to hear stories, to listen, and to learn. It's the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. We've had some phenomenal conversations from different individuals, and now we're going to the political level. And we're going to have some fun chatting with Minister Patty Hajdu. How are you doing? And thank you for joining us today.
Well, I'm doing really well. I'm in Ottawa today. It's a beautiful sunny day, and I have one of the best portfolios that the government of Canada actually holds, and that is the Minister of Indigenous Services Canada. And I say it's the best portfolio in my mind because it's all about service to First Nations, but I also get a chance to travel across the country and visit with First Nations communities and people, Indigenous people, Métis, Inuit people, and hear the story of this country from an entirely different perspective. And I've learned so much as a person, but I've also it's really inspired me to keep doing this work.
Now, you're also the MP for Thunder Bay and Superior North, right?
That's right. Yeah, it's a large riding in Northern Ontario.
Yes, and I'd imagine there's a lot of Indigenous influences there as well, just being further north. Was this a cabinet that you wanted to be a part of initially, or has it been a part of your own fabric?
It is a part of my fabric. That's a good way to put it. Certainly, it was a big reason why I entered federal politics, not so much around specifically Indigenous people, but I come from the world of housing, homelessness, and substance use. And so prior to politics, I ran a large homeless shelter in Northern Ontario. It's the largest one actually in Northern Ontario. And we sheltered about 66 people a night, men, women, and youth over 16. And about 80% of those people were First Nations or Indigenous. And it really started to, the questions that so many of us have. How did people end up like this? What is their story? I had a really I would say honored position to be able to listen to people and hear their stories. And what I realized in that work was that so many things conspire to actually prevent people from reaching their full potential, and even more so for First Nations or Indigenous people. Yeah. And that's actually one of the reasons I went into politics, because I really believe that when people have a fair chance to reach their full potential, regardless of their birth circumstances, that actually we all do better in our communities, and that poverty and exclusion and social isolation and all of that is not just, it's not just sort of unavoidable. It is actually, it's actually harmful for all of us if we don't take those things seriously and we don't work to make sure everybody is cared for in our communities.
Now, for those who are joining us via radio and not watching this on YouTube, they will be missing out on the beautiful orange shirt that you are wearing today, as September 30th across our nation is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, but also, as my kids know it, Orange Shirt Day. And so I would love to know what that means to you.
Well, obviously, many of your listeners will know that this was started. It was an advocacy movement, actually, to honor Phyllis Webstad, who was a student at St. Joseph Mission's residential school in BC, and she wore an orange shirt on her first day. And like many students, her story is extremely sad. And many advocates had been fighting for a National Truth and Reconciliation Day because they felt that it was important for their fellow Canadians to know the stories of their families and their children and their grandchildren and their grandparents in many cases. And so for me, this is, a real honor that our government has proceeded and has this national holiday that is really about Canadians coming together in all kinds of different ways across the country to learn more about each other. And in particular, to learn more about the ways that Canada, the formation of Canada, the colonies, that's the root of colonization, actually deeply impacted outcomes for Indigenous communities. And so that's the sort of birth of the National Truth and Reconciliation Day. But it is a real, it's so heartwarming to see communities across the country holding events, different advocacy groups holding events, but also just municipalities, small rural communities, just in their own way, individual Canadians honoring what this means.
It might feel to some that it's just a day and the government saying, okay, we've kind of done our part, so now it's up to you. But that's not the case. There's a lot of things that our government is doing to move ahead in these initiatives. So what are some of those things that are happening on a federal level?
Yeah, well, 9 years ago, when our Liberal government was elected, we didn't really talk as a country about reconciliation all that much. There were a few things that had happened over the course of the, many years that the government of Canada has been in existence. But of course, for First Nations people, they really felt that their priorities and the need for a restoration of relationship with Canada had been ignored. And so since 2015, so many things. We launched and completed an inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women. I think for me, the most profound things that we've done is we've co-developed legislation with Indigenous partners to give back control over some very important things to them. Primarily, for example, child welfare, the ability for First Nations communities to be able to take care of their own families and children without the interference of non-Indigenous child welfare agencies that often have not done any better or even worse than what would have happened to that child in their own community.
Yeah. Oh, some of those stories are just devastating. We had a conversation with the lady who was a part of the 60s scoop. And so just hearing those experiences is truly heartbreaking. And I think as Canadians, it can feel overwhelming. There are so many devastating stories. And now we have this day and we don't really know where to start. Like, how do we make meaningful steps forward in this healing journey? So what would you suggest be some practical ways for Canadians to observe the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation?
Yeah, I mean, it's really independent on the individual and what they want to do. But I will just say that, like I've said earlier, there are all kinds of different activities happening across the country: marches and walks and bike rides and gatherings, storytelling and circles and healing fires. And so I would first of all say, look up one of those events in your own region and see if it's something you might be willing to attend, and bring your children. There's a lot of joy as well. It sounds, this is a heavy subject. And of course, there's been a lot of grief and trauma, but there's a lot of humor in First Nations communities. And you might find that you really have a good time getting to know people in your own community in a different way and listening to their stories. I think the third thing I would just say is that, of course, there's reconciliation action that has to happen at the federal level, at the provincial level, at the municipal level, through governments, and the way that we spend our money and the way that we organize ourselves. Understandably, we need to change so many things so that we can do this in a fair, honorable way. But reconciliation for me, it really does start with personal relationships. It's hard, even as a politician, to work on an issue if you've never met anyone affected by that issue, if you've never actually been in a community that needs the thing that you're thinking about doing. And so reconciliation is much like that. It's so personal. And so we all have friends and, colleagues, neighbors, people that our kids play soccer with. Reach out and talk to them about their story. Ask where their home community is, whether their parents grew up in an urban setting or in a First Nation. Is there a way that you can, take care of someone on your street that is struggling? Maybe there's an elder that needs their driveway shoveled. It's rooted in compassion and in listening to each other. And I think oftentimes in our story, in Canada, we've really othered each other, and I would say that sometimes that goes both ways. Many First Nations people don't have a high degree of trust of non-Indigenous people. But the more that we break that down by coming together and understanding that we all want our children to succeed. We all want to live in a safe environment. We all want to feel like we matter and that we have purpose in this life. That's where the real healing begins. So for me, my best advice to Canadians is get to know each other and get to know how we support each other in our communities.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've had several years in this particular position and a lot of, I think, personal experiences. So I'm curious to know what has been one of the more invaluable lessons that you've learned from Indigenous people.
Well, a couple come to mind. I mean, first, I would just say the listening that I have, it's a listening exercise in many ways for me. I'm not a very patient person. I'm sort of a Western type A person. Like if I go to a meeting, I want to know like what's the agenda and how long is it going to be and what's the accomplishments and how are we going to get out of there in an hour? That's kind of how my brains works, and I just kind of want to go from like point A to point Z very quickly. And what I've had to learn is to really lean into the ceremony and the way that Indigenous culture is transmitted to each other, which is completely different than a Western, very sort of type A, from A to Z. There is a lot of room in First Nations ways of doing things for listening to each other, for listening to the land, for learning from one another. And so when I first got this job, I thought, what if I don't have the patience to sit through ceremony? What if I don't have the patience to listen to the beginning of, a meeting where you may have an elder speak for some time about what their hopes are for the meeting and give blessings for the work of the day. And I realized that was exactly my job, to be in those rooms, to be in those communities, and to operate at the speed of the community that I found myself in. And it's all different all across the country. Ceremonies are different, processes are different, protocol is different, but everyone's been a gift. And so for me, what I've what I've learned about myself is that other ways of doing things are just as effective. They may not seem on the surface as effective as a Western go kind of approach where, everybody has 2 minutes and that's that. But rather that collective way of sharing knowledge, that collective way of starting a meeting, centering ourselves before we do the work to remind ourselves of why we're in the room, what we hope for out of this particular engagement or meeting. It's such a gift for me. I can't even tell you, to be able to be present without an expectation of what should happen at the end. And then finally, I would just say, the humor, and I mentioned it earlier, there is so much humor. And, there's a welcomingness to this work where people, I used to be gifted. I still am gifted. There's a huge gifting culture as part of Indigenous life. And I used to cry every time I got a gift. It was so embarrassing. I'd get this gift, I'd start crying, and I knew why I was crying, but I was like also embarrassed to say why I was crying. And one day I just said it. I said, the hopefulness that this gift represents makes me think of the generations of gifts that have been given to politicians, just like me, who have come to your community and you have sat with them and tried to teach them about you and tried to work with them in a shared path. And I hope that I live up to the promise of this gift. And so there's so much beauty in this world. I think that's why it's been my favorite portfolio, because I've learned about myself. I've been taught new ways, and I have this, I would say, clear sense of purpose in this work, like nothing else I've ever done.
Oh, I love that so much. Just hearing your passion for how you're serving the Indigenous communities, but also like the rest of Canada in being able to share what you're learning is super beautiful. And I know you said like there's that part of like getting rid of the type A element to things and just not having expectations, but humor me because I haven't gone through that process yet of growth. So do you have any expectations or goals that you would like to see accomplished by these steps that we're making to hopefully reconcile and to like just be more holistic in our approach, working together?
Yeah, two pieces that I really hope that I can get done before an election. So you're right, back to deadlines. And the deadline is we could have an election in this country like tomorrow, or we could have an election in December, or we could have an election in May. And so what I'm really hoping is that we'll have the participation of the opposition parties to get some really important things done. And the two priorities for me are, first of all, the child welfare agreement. There is a $48 billion child welfare agreement in front of First Nations leaders, chiefs right now. They will vote on that agreement in October. And what that essentially will do is take that next really important fiscal step on supporting First Nations communities across this country to deliver child and family services in ways that are going to protect kids, keep kids closer to home, strengthen the capacity of communities, and really importantly, do that prevention work so that families have what they need to stay healthy, to be healthy, to recover from trauma, and to keep their kids closer to home. So this is a very important healing piece for the entire country because, of course, healthy kids are productive Canadians and are the ones that we're going to need to meet the challenges of the future, to build up our whole entire community and economy. So there's
no pressure.
No pressure. No pressure, kids. Here you go. But we do know that when kids are raised close to home with language and culture and family, that their outcomes are so much better. And so this is a really pivotal piece. So I'm hoping we can tie the bow on that piece of work. The other piece is that water legislation, which would really entrench the gains that we've made since 2015 on long-term boil water advisories, put control back in the hands of First Nations with regulation setting, with protection of source water, with adequate co-developed funding models, so we never see what we saw in 2015 when we took over from the Harper Conservatives, where there were well over 145 boil water advisories across the country, long-term boil water advisories. We're down to 32. It's still 32 too many, and I'm well aware of that. But we have made huge progress on this file. 94% of First Nations have access to clean water. We're going to finish those 32 together with First Nations, but we don't want any backsliding. And this piece of legislation would put the legal framework in place to hold Canada accountable, to make sure that we can never see a return to those days where so many First Nations don't have clean water to drink or bathe with.
Yeah. I remember hearing about those stories, and it's just like, how is this still a
How
thing?
does it happen in such a wealthy country like ours?
Yeah.
And so we've learned a lot over the last 9 years about the complexity of that. And there is, obviously a shared path with First Nations. Canadians can follow along. This is something Canadians care deeply about. And actually, our government has a website that you can check out every long-term boil water advisory and which stage they're in. There's about half of them that are waiting for Chief and Council to actually lift the advisory. They have the control to decide when their community feels safe enough to do that. The water is clean, but the community is doing some work on trust around the water. You can imagine if you haven't had clean water for 20 years, you don't trust the water. So They do a lot of work to try to get their communities to that space. Then there's another, handful or so that are in, they're being built. So they're still in construction. And then there's 2 or 3 that are still trying to figure out the best model for them, because they have either like a small urban area with a lot of dispersed population that are typically on wells, that kind of thing. And they're looking for the best solution. So we really are very close, but we want to make sure we never go back.
Yeah, amazing. Okay, well, Minister Hajdu, the floor is yours. Is there any final thoughts that you have?
Well, just thank you so much for the conversation, and thank you to your listeners for wanting these conversations. This is actually what drives good politics forward, is that Canadians demand progress on things and on files like reconciliation. And so the more people know about not just the story of this country and the challenges that First Nations and Indigenous people have faced, but the more that they know about how they can be part of that relationship building and that recovery, I think the more they'll hold all of us as politicians and elected officials accountable for policies that truly do ensure everyone has a fair chance to succeed. And ultimately, that's what we all want, right?
Absolutely. That's why we take days like today to pause and learn and listen and hopefully grow. So thank you so much for taking time today to share about what you're up to, what you've seen, and your hopes and dreams as we continue to build better bridges between the communities.
Thank you so much. Really appreciated the conversation, and best of luck with everything you're doing.
Thank you.